Yeah, but can you do that? Autofocus modes, the best portrait autofocus modes for the Nikon Z6 II. Thank you, B&H, for letting us play with the Nikon Z6 II. Now, before we talk about autofocus, we should talk about assessing yourself, okay? Because the technology in these cameras, the automated technology like eye autofocus and tracking and all these decisions you need to make before you snap the shutter, a lot of it has to do with assessing the situation as a photographer. So are you shooting at a shallow depth of field? Are you shooting with a really busy background that's going to confuse the camera? And even more importantly, are you shooting things that can be replicated again? Like, are you just shooting a portrait session where you can, if the camera doesn't focus, have the model do it again or have the kid do it again? If you're shooting once in a lifetime events, you as a photographer, maybe you're shooting your first couple of weddings, sometimes you need to decide, like, I'm not going to rely on the camera sort of picking out the right spot to focus. So we should really talk about, don't forget that you as a skilled photographer should still be able to like use a single focus point and focus using the correct mode, single focus mode sometimes. You know, so a lot of these automated modes are great, but you as the photographer need to decide which mode works best for which situation. So don't forget that. Now, you're smarter than your camera. So, for example, if you have a row, like 4 rows of family members, you really shouldn't be shooting at 1.4. You know, that is a depth of field issue. So I've gotten photographers that say, you know, why are my images blurry? And you should know that the camera can only, if you're shooting at 1.4, can only focus at a certain depth, okay? So the lesson here is you need to be smarter than your camera. With that said, I found that the Nikon Z6 II is excellent at taking portraits, but you need to understand the modes that will work best in the certain situations. Now, I didn't do any tests. This all comes from just portrait shoot after portrait shoot after portrait shoot, figuring out for me what works best. So I'll share that in this video, but try to assess like how you shoot if you're a slower shooter, because I shoot like a maniac. I'm trying to like get kids to laugh and be themselves in front of them. I'm not working with models. So that's one thing to know is like, what's the patience of your subjects? Are you working with babies and toddlers? That's one thing. Or are you working with a model that is used to being there for 3 hours, hair and makeup, and just waiting for you to like move your focus point to their eye? So part of it is what type of subject are you shooting as well? What's portraiture are you doing, okay? All right, so we're gonna look at a little family session I did yesterday. And I found that for most situations, using the wide area auto AF I think that's what it's called. The camera did a good. That's good to great. Really good to really great job at always finding an eye. Now on the camera, I do have the little red box to show me after where the camera focused, but I suspect that that little box needs a software update. I found that overall a wide area with the eye autofocus enabled, if your background isn't too busy, is a really good mode to stay on for most of the time during your portrait session. Now, there are a couple of times where this could be dangerous. Again, like I talked about, if it's once in a lifetime, I don't know if I would rely 100% on the IAF, because it could get confused sometimes if people turn their head, and also if the background is a little busy. So I found a couple of times with the family shoot, we were shooting in front of a brick wall, and the camera, the problem is with the eye autofocus, is if it doesn't find an eye, it will default to face, and quickly if it doesn't find the face, it's gonna go into an auto zone, which is a grid. And you could get lucky, the grid could totally pick a person, but the problem with that is that sometimes it may pick the wrong thing. So when I was photographing my family in front of a brick wall, for the most part, the eye, because I think their heads were maybe a little too small in the frame, The camera tried to find a face, and then it went into a grid which grabbed onto the wall in the back. Now the good thing is, while you're shooting, you do see the grid, and to me that's like an alarm. When I'm using wide area eye autofocus and I see the grid that takes over the entire screen, I know the camera's confused, and so I need to make a decision. That means that the background is either too busy or it can't see the faces because they're a little too small. And so that's where your skill as a portrait photographer with the Nikon Z6 II needs to come into play. You need to quickly switch into another mode. And I found that the second best mode for portraiture is just to forget eye autofocus altogether. Now, I know that you can put wide area with face. You know, you can pick a red box, which the camera will only look for an eye there. I just found personally for me, I like interacting with my subjects, and I don't like moving a focus box around. I'd rather either just have a center focus that I can focus and recompose, and not take the time into moving the box. If I turn the camera vertical, moving the box up to find an eye, and then you turn to landscape and you have to move the box because the person is on the left. I find that it takes a little too long for me. That may work for you using the face, red box and moving that around. But I found that if the camera got confused, I would move to a single area. So if the camera grid would come on, I would use my function button on the front, and quickly, since I've memorized how many clicks it takes to move to the next mode, I would switch to the wide area, no face detection, because I found that wide and the small, which is the little area, the little square box in the middle, when I was shooting track meets, I found that guy was really good at grabbing on and staying on. Barely missed any track images using that on continuous. So I would go from wide face to sort of that middle box most of the time during the portrait session. All right, so let me show you some real world examples of where I assess the situation and pick a mode. All right, so here I put the dude on a railing, and this is pretty simple for the camera, wide area, autofocus. And I found that the camera could find an eye, no problem, even if he looks away or he looks at me, piece of cake. Now, if you have two people and you're shooting portraits and you're shooting shallow, like I like to shoot shallow here, this is again at 1.4, very dangerous, 1.4 and two people. But I know that if I have them in the same plane, I'm pretty much gonna get pretty good focus. But if you're not that skilled, I would recommend going to f2 or 2.8 for a little bit more depth here. So as I shot here, even though the kids turned their heads, the wide area AF still picked them up, and it didn't turn into face, like the zone didn't go into face, it stayed on eye, because all I had them do was like look at each other really quickly, and then they looked back at camera. This is a great technique too if you want to get, people hate looking at each other, so you get a good technique, people looking at each other, and when they look back, they have real smiles, which is the shot I'm looking for. Okay, now I switched lenses. I was using a 50mm 1.4 adapted Sigma lens, and now I'm using the 70-200 2.8 Z lens, which is like one of the best lenses I've ever used. So here I'm using single focus point, but I'm still using that wide eye. And the background is a little busy. There's lines, there's brick back there, but pretty much overall the camera is picking up the eye, no problem. And I'm shooting in burst. Now, if the kid moves, she moved out of the plane for a second, and the camera had her in focus, and then it was out of focus for a millisecond. And if you're shooting, and then it came back to focus. So it could be that she moved out of, sometimes you can't really assess why something is out of focus. We're talking a millisecond here. And since I'm shooting in single focus point, if someone moves out of the focal plane, I do have to pump that button again to re-grab focus. So on my Sony a7 III, I shoot continuous focus 100% of the time. With the Nikon Z series, I have found that because I'm learning the system a little bit more, I like to see the confirmation green dots. And in continuous focus, you don't get any confirmation that you have autofocus. So here I was using single focus, but later you'll see that I change into continuous focus. So pretty much the same thing, single focus. She is always in focus here. Let's zoom in and look at the eyes. So here we have IAF, and here it missed once. And again, sometimes here it missed twice, and then we're back into autofocus. So the eye autofocus, I would say, is 80 to 85, 90% hit rate. Maybe even higher. You know, I didn't do any exact tests, but as you can see here, these are all super sharp. The eye, look at that lens, 70 to 200. Video on that guy coming too. Best lens ever. All right, with 4 people, you have a couple of choices. Here I decided to use the wide AF as well. And it found mom's eye, it found the kid's eye. Sometimes it went between 2. Here's an example where you need to assess the situation and use eye autofocus, but you probably want to keep you want to know how much depth your lens has. So here I'm shooting the 50mm 1.4. I moved it to 2.0. That's dangerous, by the way. I would probably move, if you're shooting 4 people, you should probably be at 2.8 or f4 if you want a shallow depth of field, still want a shallow depth of field. But I kind of got away with it here at f2 because I knew they were pretty much in the same focal plane based on my distance. And that has a lot to do with too. If all of a sudden I jump forward and I move closer to people, then my depth goes from this much at f2 to this much. And you're going to get people that are out of focus. So your understanding of depth of field and focal plane, and that goes with autofocus as well. So I knew here that I had enough depth, so I used the IAF, okay? If I don't have enough depth and I need to pick, I would probably go back to the single box and maybe move it around, okay? Now with the family on the brick wall, we always like to do kind of like a rock band, sort of cool album shot of the family, so they all look like models. And here I was using the wide AF eye, and I think their heads were a little bit too small for the camera. It was finding eye, then it went to face for a second, and then all of a sudden it was like Grid City. And that's where I got a little bit nervous because Grid City likes the wall in the back. And so one way I could have combated this was to move them away from the wall. They're a little too close to it. It's a busy pattern back there. And the other thing I probably could have done was just change really quickly to an autofocus box. And for the most part, it did an okay job, but every now and then it would go to face detection and not detect mom's face. It would focus maybe on the wall. So that was a situation where I should have switched to a different mode. Now, when I'm not using wide AF auto, I think my favorite one is the rectangular wide autofocus, especially when you get the family moving. And so here I got them to just walk towards camera. I laid down on the gross ground and completely had them walking towards camera. And every single shot is in focus. No IAF, no tracking. I just used the red rectangular autofocus continuous rectangle. I was about to say box, but it's a rectangle. And that worked great. That worked great during the track meet. That worked great during family members just walking up. Every single shot is in focus. Now, we should talk also about your burst rate. So for portraits, I'm not shooting 20 frames a second, 12 frames a second, 14 frames a second. That's kind of ridiculous for portraits. So you should at least be, I'm at like 5 frames a second. That's what I need to get images. So 5 frames a second to me gives me expression, enough in autofocus, and what I'm looking for. Now for shooting vertical, either full length portraits or 3/4, I like that rectangular box. I don't need to go to eye autofocus. If the person takes up most of the frame, you put them in that rectangle, and I'm shooting in continuous autofocus. Even though the kid here, she's not moving forward and backward, the camera does a good job and I have enough depth. I'm shooting 3.2 with the 70 to 200, and it grabs focus just pretty much every single time. I would say 100% here. We have enough depth. She's not doing anything super crazy forward and backward, and so the camera found her every single time. So I don't need to go to IAF because as soon as she flips her hair around, the camera's like, what? Brick wall? You know, so I'm going to stick to that rectangle, and it just knows the contrast there, that it needs to stay on her the whole time. And she did all kinds of crazy stuff. Now, I did get her to walk forward, and it grabbed focus every single time with her coming in. Now, same brick wall in the background, and have mom and daughter hugging. Now, what mode do I use? Well, you could stay on the rectangle, continuous. They're in the middle. The rectangle's in the middle. But I decided to use wide AF here as well. I just quickly switched to wide AF. And here, it just grabbed eye autofocus. You can also, since the rectangle's in the middle, you could actually change to face in the rectangle. And you got to get quick. You got to get quick with the different modes and see them. And this worked great. So IAF, the rectangle was in the right spot. I know when I go landscape, sometimes if you have face detection, the rectangle's not reaching their face. So you actually have to use the joystick to move up. So that's why I usually like the wide AF. Now, we should also talk about, I'm going to go back to skill of photographer. These moments, these are real moments because I'm talking and interacting and loving the family as well. If you're fumbling with your camera and focus modes, you're not really going to get great expressions. So you have to either stick it to single focus point and work with the family, or know how to switch on the fly, memorize your autofocus settings to get better expressions from your clients. Now, I will say that you can limit the number of autofocus choices. So you can go right from wide, you can tell the camera, don't ever, if I'm flipping the dial, don't go to pinpoint, don't go to a tiny box, just always go to the rectangle and go to an eye. Now, this in front of green and a kid standing there, wide AF eye, no freaking problems. A full-length kid here, wide AF eye, no freaking problems. He's not moving, the camera finds his eye. I'm shooting at 1.4, no freaking problems. Even two people shooting at 1.4, found the face, no, you know what I'm gonna say. No freaking problems. Again, a full length, I'm on wide autofocus. I'm also shooting continuous now. So before I said I was liking a confirmation, but after a while, I was seeing that I was getting a lot of hits with continuous focus. So I kind of just stayed on wide AF continuous, even though the kid isn't moving. So I prefer on my Sony a7 III that I get green confirmation that lives full time on continuous, but it's okay. It's okay, it grabbed. Now the camera does sometimes miss focus and you can't explain it. So here I'm on continuous autofocus. It wavers a little bit. It wavered off his face for some reason. I do have some green things on the foreground, but it never focused on those. But then it quickly snapped back. I went from 70 millimeters, I zoomed in a little bit to 87 millimeters, and it found his face the whole time. We got a great laugh here. And he looks awesome. He's totally in focus in all of these. All right, now we're shooting at 200 millimeters, and you have to assess how tiny is the subject's head in the frame. So here it would find eye, but then it would go to face, and then it would go to grid. It was deciding. And as soon as I see the camera deciding, I get a little nervous, okay? So if you see the camera deciding, I would say pick something that's a little bit more reliable. And what I did was I went to my rectangle, okay? Rectangle center. I know it's gonna find him, and it did a great job. Especially when we had him walking forward, we got the rectangle, no face, just rectangle, and it completely grabbed every shot as he's walking forward. And so that's kind of my way of thinking when I am shooting the Z6 II center that's reliable and a wide AF. I'll see you next time.
Peace!